Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Content warning for this episode. We're talking about Chernobyl. So, Kayla, take it away.
Okay. Although pictures of the abandoned company city of Pripyat and the decimated control room of Unit 4 at the Chernobyl power plant may lead you to believe that the disaster at Chernobyl occurred during the height of the Cold War, this crisis was far more recent than that. In April of 1986, The Money Pit starring Tom Hanks had only just released. The song Take My Breath Away was brand new, and a whole generation of students in the United States was still reeling from having been shown the Challenger disaster live in their classrooms only 3 months before. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster that occurred in Soviet Ukraine of April 1986 remains the worst nuclear disaster in world history. A harrowing mix of improper training and poor safety regulations resulted in the deaths of 2 people immediately and a further 28 in the coming months, though many more people were sickened from radiation poisoning in the years that followed. This will be a 2-part series, at least. Today's episode will set the stage for the errors that culminated in disaster and will walk listeners step by step through the chaos until the evacuation of Pripyat, a full day and a half after the accident occurred.
Okay.
So last November, we discussed the Manhattan Project in detail, and we described the journey that American scientists took in Los Alamos toward engineering and detonating the world's first atomic bomb on July 16, 1945. I also mentioned that Russia followed somewhat soon thereafter, conducting their first nuclear test on August 29, 1949. In the documentary Chernobyl, Secrets and Lies, The Untold Stories, which is available on HBO, Serhiy Plotky, also the author of one of our sources today, described the nuclear arms and energy race by saying that America was the first to the bomb, but the Soviet Union was the first to nuclear power. And I think that's probably part of the reason that they invested in nuclear power, to show their scientific and technological prowess, but I think that's too singular of a reason.
Okay.
There's just no way that anyone who bore witness to an atomic bomb detonation wouldn't be scared shitless from the power and the destruction. But the people with the power to build and detonate these bombs were also invested in harnessing that power. And it wasn't just Americans who realized the potential for commercial electricity generation through nuclear energy. After their Chicago Pal 1 demonstration, kind of everybody knew about it. So the Soviets realized it as well. And yes, Americans technically did build the first nuclear power plant for electricity in 1951 in Arco, Idaho. But the Soviets were the first to build a plant and connect it to a grid for commercial use in 1954.
So the difference being, like, we had built it, but we weren't using it.
Yeah, we weren't
really.
using it in a commercial way.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And this plant that they established in 1954 was the Obninsk power plant, located in Russia just 74 miles southwest of Moscow. It was a sign not only that the USSR existed at the cutting edge of science alongside other first world countries, but also a sign from Soviet politicians to their citizens and the rest of the world that the Union was doing well economically, because nuclear power was expensive to get started. And it's not like they were experiencing a shortage of power or an upswing in population that necessitated more power. Like, they could have gotten along just fine with coal.
Mm-hmm.
They did it because they could. Also, and not entirely coincidentally, Obninsk and nuclear power came to represent peace in the midst of the Cold War.
We're using this for something different? We're not using... Okay.
Yeah. So in December of 1953, U.S. President Eisenhower gave his Atoms for Peace speech to the United Nations, in which he essentially said that now the U.S. and the USSR both had atomic bombs, and so we were kind of in a standoff, the Cold War, that could only end in mutually assured destruction should either one of them choose to bomb the other. He called for disarmament and peace in the form of atomic energy that would benefit the world for things like agriculture and medicine. Of course, this was really just a guise that gave everyone cover to continue what they were doing more secretly, but also somewhat more openly, like, oh yeah, we have all of this energy going into nuclear power, so to speak, but it's totally above board. Under Atoms for Peace programs, the U.S. distributed 25 tons of highly enriched uranium to 30 other countries for research and peaceful reactors.
Oh.
And this included the countries of Iran, Israel, Pakistan, India, Argentina, Brazil, and apartheid-era South Africa. So we're not exactly doing ourselves any favors here.
Right.
The USSR adopted similar programs and exported 11 tons of highly enriched uranium to countries with which they were allied and promoted their peaceful reactors, like Obninsk, which were not only capable of producing huge amounts of power, but the reactors on this side could be used to generate plutonium that they would need if they decided to warm up the Cold War with an atomic bomb. In the spirit of disarmament, these reactors are not used in the West now. I'm not sure about previously, but it wasn't Atoms for Peace. It's not economical to build your reactors this way, and it's not safe to have essentially a huge bomb producing electricity for your region. The reactor at Obninsk was built by the same men who built the first Soviet atomic bomb. Like, same group of guys were Atoms for Peace now.
Okay.
It was a small reactor, being the world's first, and it only generated about 5 megawatts of power, which is enough to supply power to around 5 million homes, so it's not nothing.
Yeah.
Originally, it provided the proving grounds for atomic naval applications for deployment on submarines.
Oh.
Yeah, which we talked all about in our K-19 microdose.
Yeah. Also very light and not a bummer at all.
Yeah, and Obninsk was eventually abandoned for this, so they were like, this isn't quite working out. I mean, they kept putting reactors on submarines, as we learned, but So the difference between a nuclear bomb and a nuclear reactor is that a bomb is meant to fission atoms and release a huge amount of energy in a split second, while a reactor sustains the fission reaction to hold on to that energy for weeks or months, or really however long it can be maintained.
Okay.
And listeners may recall from our Manhattan Project series that the Chicago Pile 1 reactor built by doctors Arthur Compton and Enrico Fermi proved the safety of graphite nuclear piles, hence the name. They were piles of graphite. For their ability to produce more neutrons than they absorbed within the reactor system, which led to a self-sustaining chain reaction from which energy could be harnessed.
Okay.
The Atom Mirny 1 reactor at Obninsk worked in a similar way, using both graphite and water coolant to control the reaction, but it had a design risk known as the positive void coefficient. Nuclear reactors controlled by water produce steam. This is most reactors out there. We use steam to generate the turbines, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the clouds that come out of the cones at nuclear power plants, they don't contain fission products, they don't contain smoke. This is just steam from distilled water. So anytime you see something coming out of a nuclear power plant and alarms aren't being sounded, it's just water.
It's just steam. Yeah.
Nothing to be concerned about.
Okay.
Some of this steam circulates through the core of the reactors. And in these types of reactors, like in the Soviet Union, they form voids in the liquid, and this decreases the reactivity in the core. In reactors that use water as the coolant and the modulator of the reaction, too many steam voids can cause the reaction to increase, but without water to modulate it, it will eventually shut down, and this is common in Western reactor designs. But at Obninsk, the water was only used as a coolant, and graphite was used as the moderator. And so when the voids are created and the coolant is displaced or even decreased because of steam, the reaction does not shut down because the graphite will continue to perpetuate the reaction. And so you're losing a ton of steam, you're losing water, the reactor gets hotter and hotter and turns more water into more steam. You get this feedback loop, and that's what causes a runaway reaction. And this will be important to remember later because Obninsk was the prototype for the RBMK-type reactor built at Chernobyl. Although the city of Chernobyl has existed since roughly 1193 and has seen many different flavors of occupation and control, the power plant we associate with it was not built until 1972. At that time, the city sat in northern Soviet Ukraine, 60 miles northwest of Kyiv, and 450 miles southwest of Moscow. Originally, it was called the Central Ukrainian Nuclear Power Plant, but its official title was either the Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station or the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin Nuclear Power Plant. And a statue of the former leader is one of the few from the Soviet Union that still stands to this day in the now abandoned town of Pripyat.
Wow.
And many of the photos that you may have seen from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster of abandoned apartments and even that Ferris wheel that's in a lot of photos,
Right.
that's not actually from the town of Chernobyl. That's from Pripyat.
Oh.
And Pripyat was the company town that was established just 2 miles from the plant.
Okay. So it's very near.
It was extremely close by for like convenience to get there. And also there was a little bit of like health and sanitary requirements that you don't build anything in like a sanitary zone around the plant just in case, you know? So like there was water that they didn't want to be impacted. They didn't want plants to be impacted to, you know, low level ionization. Like they weren't thinking about a huge nuclear meltdown. They were mostly just like, in general, we don't like this.
The common day sustainability of it.
Yes, exactly. Although consideration for the sanitary zone around Chernobyl was kind of disregarded in the years that followed the settlement of Pripyat in 1972, and people started edging closer and closer to Chernobyl because they were like, well, there's nothing here. Nobody's using this spot, so I could put my garden here. Yeah. Much like Los Alamos, Pripyat was a closed city, or what the Soviets called an Atomgrad, which was made up of workers and their families, who were mostly young people recruited from all across the Soviet Union to construct, maintain, and support the power plant. It was more of a privilege to live in Pripyat than Los Alamos, though. And, like, both of them had their issues with getting started, and, like, you know, they didn't necessarily have everything built on time and all of that. But because it was considered like this modern city at the edge of science and these people were fulfilling a patriotic duty, resources were poured into this city that other parts of the Soviet Union did not get. Elsewhere across the USSR, people were experiencing food shortages, issues with housing, and the inhabitants of Pripyat didn't have any of those issues. There were about 1,000 children born every year in the city, and they were able to meet the expectations and needs of these families. And by the time of the disaster in 1986, the total population was roughly 49,000 people, and the average age was 26. So a very young community.
Yeah, I would say so.
They had 5 elementary schools, 2 stadiums, 2 swimming pools, and a skating rink. And this was much more than almost any other city in the Soviet Union. And much of it was paid for with money laundered for the power plant. So, you know.
Above board, of course.
Totally. But, you know, it's all for the safety and happiness of their peaceful atom workforce. So,
Right.
Yeah. And Los Alamos was a bomb project which required secrecy and demanded a closed city. But in the Soviet Union, all involvement with nuclear science was treated with the same classified level of secrecy. So,
okay.
I mean, you could be making a bomb with the reactors that they have, but, like, no matter what, it's super, super top secret. And so, for this reason, it was not just the young residents of Pripyat who worked at the nuclear power plant. There were also 17 KGB agents and 50 informants who were planted among the workers when the plant was opened in 1977. For listeners who don't know, the KGB is just like the letters themselves mean it's like a security safety force in Soviet Russia. But
yeah, of course.
They're just here for your safety. Yeah.
Right.
No, they were the secret police, and so they would kick in doors and kick in heads if they needed to. But they were also there to ensure the safety of this power plant. In the 1980s, the information shared by KGB was held in secret. But with the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in 2014, the documents created by these agents have since been released to researchers. Not only were the informants sharing tips about possible foreign agents or espionage, but also issues with the plant itself. Since the plant was considered and run under the old Soviet mentality of get it done on time or else you're a saboteur, it, people thought that they could get fired or imprisoned if they tried to slow down anything. So you couldn't question anything, work couldn't be halted, work couldn't be redone. And it's very likely that these are the only records that ever existed to indicate that anything untoward was noticed early on, because nobody else other than the KGB would have had the freedom to say, hey, we have some issues that we've noticed.
Right.
There was no ignoring that the original deadline for opening the power plant was missed due to the supply of nuclear parts and equipment, which meant that fuel was first loaded into the core in 1977 rather than 1975. However, it is only through the KGB memos that anyone learned that there was a problem with the pouring of the concrete for the foundation of the reactor.
Oh.
Possibly as early as 1972, we knew that this could lead to accidents.
Accidents.
Whoopsie daisies.
Yeah, that's like when I think of an accident, like, oops, I knocked this over, my bad.
Yeah.
Like...
Yeah. These agents also voiced concerns that the cooling pumps showed issues, and the fact that the reactor didn't have any containment buildings or safety shield in the event of an emergency was also very concerning to them. And it's not like this was early nuclear history, and so they just didn't know, and the agents were picking up on possible problems. A 1983 report identified only 3 out of the 13 or so plants in the Soviet Union did not have these safety shields. And that was Chernobyl, Leningrad, and Kursk. This same memo went on to say that in the event of a major accident at Chernobyl, a lack of a safety shield could release 60 times more radiation than was released during the atomic bombing of Hiroshima.
So kind of a big deal.
It would be
a big deal.
A big whoopsie daisy.
Yeah.
This is because the reactor at Chernobyl was that RBMK reactor, which means that it was a high-powered channel-type reactor, and it was the largest and most powerful reactor type in the world at that time.
Oh.
The RBMK design was that of a large steel pressure vessel, which surrounded everything, and then the core was surrounded by a steel tank in a concrete vault. And each fuel assembly, this was the most important and differentiating part, is that each fuel assembly was enclosed in a channel, which contained water coolant, and that was surrounded by graphite. So you basically have what amounts to individual reactors that make
that make up one big reactor?
Huge reactor. It is such a large reactor, it's almost unwieldy, which, I guess you could have guessed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now initially, Chernobyl was meant to be a water energy reactor, which was the Soviet equivalent to the pressurized water reactors that we have here in the United States. And these were very safe reactors in which increased heat would shut down the reactor. And so, that reduction of coolant, those positive voids being made, would shut down the reaction. However, after the partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island in 1979, the Soviets were probably feeling pretty good about the safety of their reactors compared to those water reactors, which also didn't produce as much energy or make as much money as these graphite-modulated RBMKs. But the RBMKs hadn't quite been fully tested,
What?
Rushing things through test and production again.
Yeah.
At Chernobyl, authorities further reduced costs by eliminating the containment buildings from the design. So it wasn't a bug, it was a feature. But this wasn't the only problem at Chernobyl. Because the RBMK type reactor was so large, like I said, it was very difficult to control and maintain it while it was running. Reactivity in one part of it was only loosely related to activity in another part, especially because you have this design where every channel has its own water and it's got its own series of pipes, and these pipes are all subject to their own special leaks that you have to go fix, and you can't reroute water to adjust it,
Mm-hmm.
So operators had to make dozens of adjustments every minute to keep things working as they were supposed to. And it was more
Oh.
like controlling separate, smaller reactors in this way.
Right, like little independent ones almost.
Exactly.
Like they're a part of a bigger one, but it
Yes.
seems like they're run independently.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly how it felt. And so this was a very mentally and physically draining task, and it required a lot of training. Hotspots deep inside the core were hard to detect, and these hotspots were especially pronounced during startup and shutdown when the reactor was operating on lower power. So the systems in place to detect, hotspots and reactivity were even less reliable during these periods.
Mm-hmm.
And Chernobyl had 4 of these reactors, and there were plans for a 5th to be built by the end of 1986. And each reactor contained over 190,000 kilograms of uranium.
That seems like a lot.
Well, they were planning on using it forever. So.
Yeah, that seems like a lot, but...
In 1980, the Scientific Research and Design Institute of Energy Technology of the USSR completed a study that listed 9 major design flaws and thermohydraulic instabilities which undermined the safety of the RBMK-type reactor further. The report made it clear that accidents were not only possible in rare circumstances, but highly likely in the course of everyday operation.
Highly likely is not what I want to hear about accidents at a nuclear power plant. I never want to hear that, like, those two phrases together in one sentence.
Just Homer Simpson is manning all
every
systems.
Reactor. Yeah, right? Like, honestly.
Yeah. Despite these findings, no changes were made to the reactor design, nor were personnel warned or educated on the known hazards. Instead, the men in charge decided that updated safety manuals would suffice.
Because we know that employees are keen on reading safety manuals just throughout the course of a day. Being like,
Obviously.
You know what I haven't read in a day or two? The safety manual.
Yeah.
I should check that out. Like,
it's thrilling stuff.
People read that like maybe when they get hired.
Yeah.
Maybe. And then...
maybe when something goes wrong, they're like, what does the buzzing
What do I
mean?
do? Yeah. What does it mean?
Between 1979 and 1982, there were 27 recorded accidents and several shutdowns at the Chernobyl plant. Because of the secrecy surrounding the nuclear plant, not even the specialists working at Chernobyl necessarily knew about each incident. On September 9, 1982, the chief of the turbine department for Units 3 and 4 saw steam rising from the top of a vent stack, which he knew meant that there was at least a broken pipe inside the reactor, and possibly that radiation was leaking out. But when he called the control room of Unit 1 to tell the operators to shut down the reactor, the shift supervisors brushed him off. He waited for things to worsen so that he would get a call down, but none came. He inquired about the situation the next morning and was told that there had been a problem. Sure, yeah, there was totally a problem. But no radiation was released, so it's not a big deal. And KGB officers were taking measures, quote, to prevent the spread of panic mongering. So shut the fuck up and do your job. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, look away. This isn't a big deal, and shut your fat mouth.
Yeah. In reality, Unit 1 experienced a partial meltdown when the reactor was brought online following routine maintenance. During startup, one of the cooling valves remained closed, the channel overheated, and it ruptured, just like the chief suspected. The radioactive contamination from the rupture was carried away on the wind, and then poison clouds and rained radioactive iodine-131, zinc-65, and zirconium-niobium-95, as well as fragments of uranium oxide fuel, onto Pripyat and the village of Chistogolovka. The Atomic Energy Authority rinsed the contaminated areas with water and foam, and at best repaved with fresh asphalt.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. No one was killed as a result of this contamination, as far as records show, but workers were exposed to high levels of radiation over the 8 months it took to repair the rupture. The incident was classified as top secret, however, and the chief engineer, who was responsible for having this happen under his watch and doing nothing, was reassigned to a position in Bulgaria. And that was that. We're just wiping our hands clean of this whole thing. At the end of 1983, engineers at Chernobyl noticed a glitch with their scram button.
What's that?
Well, it could stand for a bunch of different things. It could stand for safety control rod activation mechanism or something about Axeman. I don't really know. I think people are just making up what scram means. But
Okay.
what it is part of the emergency shutdown system includes this scram button. And this button activates the initial stage of a 5-level rapid power reduction system called the AZ5. This drives 211 control rods into the core and quenches the chain reaction. So you always have these rods up and ready, and if like a hot spot comes along, you can put a rod in and cool it down, put the brakes on.
Okay.
The issue was that when the rods were inserted into the core during scram, instead of completing a shutdown, the rods initially had the opposite from intended effect.
No.
Yeah.
That's not good.
No, when you're trying to press the brakes and you accidentally press the gas
the
first.
acceleration, yeah.
Yes.
Not good.
Mm-mm. So yeah, the activity rose instead of falling, and this was called positive scram.
Oh.
And, yeah, all this positive stuff is actually really negative. It's not great.
Yeah.
And this is especially intense if fewer than 30 rods were already inserted into the core when scram was initiated. With fewer than 15, the scram took 6 whole seconds to dampen the reactivity, which in nuclear reactor time is like eons.
Yeah, that's like the amount of people like possibly dying. Like,
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
It's a big deal. And with 7 rods or fewer, scram was found to potentially not shut down the reactor at all, but instead trigger a runaway reaction. And in this case, engineers worried that the initial increase in the reactor power upon insertion of these rods would be so great that halting the reaction before the reactor was destroyed might be impossible. So we have this like hypothetical that we're real worried about already in like 1983.
Right. Okay.
So the reason...
And what did they do about it?
Well, I will tell
you. Can I guess? They said, not a problem. Don't you worry your little sweet head about that.
Yeah, exactly. It's just nuclear science. Don't worry about it. First, let me tell you the reason for why this all happened.
Okay.
The reason was that the RBMK type reactor was designed by the Scientific Research and Design Institute of Energy Technology, and I hope that's the last time I have to say that fucking title. It was designed by them to be cost efficient. In typical reactors, the emergency rods contain boron carbide, but when these rods are withdrawn from the core, they still hang out in a like active area of the reactor, so they're still poisoning the reaction just a little bit by hanging out in this active zone. And so, you know, it decreases it ever so slightly. It decreases energy efficiency. So for the RBMK reactor, the control rods were tipped with graphite, which is a modulator of nuclear fission. So it makes nuclear fission go.
That's what I was going to say. Modulator means it makes it happen.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, we basically have fuel on the tips of our brakes.
So we're adding gasoline to the fire.
Yes, indeed.
Kind of.
And so
okay.
when the
Great, grand.
Yeah, I feel like they could have maybe figured this out when they were making blueprints.
Designing it?
This. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when the graphite tipped rods were dipped into the water of the reactor, the energy increased temporarily before the boron carbide part of the rods entered the water and then dampened the activity. But what's more is that it's not like the rods were just immediately dropped into the core. I think that there are some designs where you do just like literally drop them when you initiate scram. But these ones lowered slowly, like very, very slowly, slower than in like almost any other type of reactor. So in PWR reactors like we have over here, they lower in a single second. And they're like, you know, a good meter or two long. They're not super short. But in the Soviet RBMK reactors, they lower at 40 centimeters per second, which means it takes 20 seconds to move them from the top retracted position to the lowest point in the core.
I'm going to venture to say that that's a design flaw because that 20 seconds when there's like an emergency is an eternity.
I know. Yeah, if 6 seconds is too long, 20 seconds is just like, what the fuck are we even doing here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So as a result of
But what do I know? What do I know?
Yeah. What do we know?
What do we know?
As a result of these findings, modifications were approved to the AZ-5 system, but they were introduced to one RBMK reactor at a time. And the reasoning for the changes were top secret, and so they were not necessarily explained to the people making the modifications if they lacked the clearance to learn that kind of information. Chernobyl Units 1, 2, and 3 were approved for these updates. They're somewhere on the horizon. But Chernobyl Unit 4 was under construction at the time and would have to wait for alteration until its scheduled shutdown in April of 1986.
Oh. Oh, no.
Is that foreshadowing?
Yeah. Oh, no.
Rather than changing the control rods, however, which engineers at Chernobyl believed was only a minor problem, they found workarounds. So,
always good things. Workaround shortcuts. Always the preferred method when dealing with nuclear power.
never goes wrong. Never ever.
Never goes wrong.
So during an unexpected reactor shutdown, engineers feared that the electricity would be cut when the unit still needed to pump coolant water to the reactor to prevent a complete meltdown. This was like kind of a general issue that they had because they hadn't done all the testing that they needed to do on Unit 4 when it was first brought online. So they had backup diesel generators that were supposed to kick on in an event of an unexpected power outage. But they took at least 45 seconds to come online, possibly up to 3 minutes. And that, was obviously way too long. Like, we've been talking how seconds are eternities. This is way too long to prevent a meltdown.
Yeah.
But the steam produced by the reactor itself might keep the turbines running long enough that 45 seconds could suffice in the event of a power loss. So, kind of a workaround, kind of also just like a test they were supposed to have done at first. But they were like, okay, we have tried to do this test on Unit 3 in 1984, and that failed. But it didn't result in a core meltdown. So how about when we're supposed to do the routine maintenance in April of 1986, we'll just run this test then. Should be totally fine.
Yeah, in 3 years, NBD. NBD.
Yeah, we'll have the workaround, quote unquote, that we need for making sure that it doesn't explode because of this graphite rod problem that we haven't had explained to us. And we'll have all of our tests checked off that we were supposed to check off forever ago.
Cool.
So, the plan was to run a rundown test during scheduled maintenance at the end of April. Preparations for this began all the way in March because you know how, like, when pilots take off, they have, like, 100 things they need to check off and check all their buttons and shit? They basically have to do this. And so, preparations begin months in advance, and there was some concern that the reactor would get out of control during the test, but nobody thought that it would, and so they were just like, nah, no, it's fine.
It couldn't happen to us.
Yeah, no, it's so unlikely. And they also had like a bunch of other system tests that they had to conduct during shutdown, so they were like, sure, it might be a problem, but it probably won't. Like, let's just not think about it. And Unit 4 was believed to be the safest reactor at Chernobyl, so they were like, gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine.
Lucky number 4, she's good to go. We don't worry about her.
The scheduled shutdown was supposed to last for 12 hours, starting at 10 p.m. on Thursday, April 24th, and then ending at 10 a.m. on Friday the 25th. Any longer than that, and the radioactivity in the reactor would fall below admissible levels. Because, like, you know how you're not supposed to, like, let the heat in your house get like super low during the day when you're not there, and then you rise it again, like they tell you to keep it like somewhere in the middle. They're kind of trying to do this where they don't like drop the energy super low.
Okay.
But the preparations for all of these super important tests they were supposed to conduct didn't begin on time. And so the late night shift passed the burden onto the third shift in the early morning hours on Friday. According to the instruction manual for the reactor, by the time the regular morning shift started, a shutdown procedure should have already been started because they'd reached the appropriate power level to do so. But a number of tests and measurements had yet to be carried out, I don't know what the fuck else they're doing. All that they have to do is work on this core, but they're not doing all of these things that they're supposed to do. And so, for some reason, it didn't happen. A supervisor was needed to approve the shutdown, and none was present. And so the reactor continues at its lower level activity with only 15 rods available to insert into the core should it start to get too hot. And so we were talking earlier, like, you don't want, like, too few to be in there if you need to initiate scram, but you also don't want, like, a ton to already be in there because, like, you know, if you're
already dampening it. Like,
yeah, if you've already, like, got the brake to the floor and you're still going, like, you don't have an emergency brake. Like, that's all you got.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
So the engineers continued on with their other duties and tests, including shutting down the emergency water supply to the reactor, which was super labor intensive, and it took 45 minutes to complete.
Not 45 minutes.
Yeah, it took a long time to do it, and it takes a long time to bring it back up. And in the interim, you don't have any additional emergency water to cool down your core. But it's fine.
Okay.
It's totally fine.
Totally fine.
So just after 2 p.m. and around 15 minutes before they were planning to finally commence this shutdown, engineers were told to delay the shutdown and keep the reactor running at a low level because they needed to continue to generate power for the grid at Kyiv because another reactor at a different plant that served the region suddenly went offline. And so they needed to make up the difference until it got fixed. Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
So with the emergency water supply shut off, they were told to keep the reactor on until the evening when the electricity demand would be lower. But the leader of the evening shift wasn't familiar with shutdown procedures because...
But why?
I don't know. I don't know.
I think that's something that everybody should know because like disasters don't pick a time of day. Like it's not like, you know, do you know what I mean? Like
Totally. But they are trying to, like, I think the proper term is stovepiping information so that you're blocking it from other people. So I think only certain people are supposed to know about shutdown procedures and startup procedures. But I feel like this guy should have known because it was the, like, nighttime people who were supposed to initiate shutdown, like, 24 hours ago. So I don't know if this is, like, a different leader and he wasn't told because it wasn't on his shift that it was happening. But, like... he doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing. Like, he thought he was going to come in and, like, be taking care of a reactor coming back up the temperature instead of, like, having to shut it down.
Shut it down, like, actually start the process.
Yes, yeah. So he was told that he would be responsible for this, but he needed to wait until he got a call from Kyiv's grid dispatcher at around 6 o'clock to give the okay to shut down. But 6 comes and goes and he doesn't get a call. And then at 9... he gets a call that they should shut down at 10, so now he's waiting for 10. Everything that had been postponed was expected to take about 2 hours, and then they would be done by midnight on April 26th. But the strike of midnight rang in a day that changed the world. The shutdown did not begin at 10. The deputy chief engineer of the plant, Anatoly Dyatlov, did not show up to begin until 11, and they, like, needed him there to start it. And at that point... it was decided to postpone the shutdown until the start of the next shift at 12, which was the same decision that had been made the previous night.
I was just going to... they just keep passing the buck at this point.
The crew before this team had been prepared to complete this task. I mean, the guy had come in at 2 and had, like, kind of been able to get up to speed because he'd had so much time being told, hurry up and wait, you know? But so now this new team coming in at 12 was... kind of rushed to get explanations and be walked through the processes that this 20-man shift would be responsible for. And Dyatlov, who should have been guiding the whole thing because he was the deputy chief engineer, he didn't do a whole lot to help this transition other than be like, I'm in charge. And then he did nothing, right?
I'm the big man.
Yeah.
Like,
very good, Anatoly. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
So at midnight, the reactor's power had been significantly reduced to 520 megawatts thermal from its normal generating capacity of 3,200 megawatts thermal. It is running at a pretty low power. Everything was going fine until the crew received an alert that the reactor's water supply had dropped unacceptably low. And remember, the emergency water shut off.
Mm-hmm.
While attempting to remedy this, some of the reactor rods were switched out of order and caused a sudden and unacceptable drop in the reactor's power level down to 30 megawatts thermal. And for a reactor, this might as well be zero. Like, it is way, 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 way too low. So quickly, the control rods were retracted to try to increase the power level. But again, this was all done in the wrong order by a crew member who didn't know what he was doing. And he was kind of starting to panic because he's not thinking like, oh, it's going to run away. He's thinking like, I am putting out the ember of the fire that like makes everything in this region run.
Right.
Somebody who was more experienced stepped in, and within 4 minutes, the power got back up to 200. Now, this is a lot lower than the recommended 700 that this turbine test that they need to do was supposed to be conducted at. But someone made the decision to just go ahead with the test anyhow. Dyatlov says it wasn't him, and basically everybody else say that it was him. So, at 12:43, Dyatlov ordered the operators to block the emergency signal that would be expected from the turbines involved in the test. 20 minutes later, they increased the water to the reactor, which was a planned part of the test, but it further destabilized the reactor. At 1:19, the low steam alarm went off. The operators shut that alarm off and shut down the water to the reactor. Unfortunately, the power in the reactor continued to fall from 200 megawatts thermal. As uranium fuel is burned, it creates fission products, and fuel rods that have already been burned for some time, like those in Unit 4, create different products than fresh fuel does. Running the reactor with spent fuel rods at such a low power level for so long caused a buildup of xenon-135. This particular byproduct poisons nuclear reactors, which causes the power to rapidly fall. According to safety procedures, the test should have been aborted and the reactor should have been shut down, but it was not. To counter this xenon well, as it's called, more rods were retracted from the reactor until only 9 remained in the core.
And how many were there before?
We have 211 that we're working with.
Oh.
And at less than 15, it takes 6 seconds to get everything under control. Yep.
Okay.
At 1:22, the reaction started to increase as the water in the heating reactor turned to steam and created those pesky positive voids. But the alarm to indicate a rise in energy was ignored, as the leader of the crew was more focused on the turbine test that was about to start. At 1:23 a.m., with the energy rising, the turbine test commenced, simulating a loss of power. The steam to the turbines was cut, and they began to slow, but still produce power to keep the main circulation pump going. The test lasted all of 36 seconds, and the diesel fuel generators failed to come on. As was planned in either case, the reactor was fully shut down by initiating scram. Unbeknownst to the crew, the 36 seconds that the test took allowed the cool water to pass through the fuel channels, which heated and turned to steam. The positive void effect engaged to its fullest potential and created a feedback loop of heat and steam and reactivity. And then they hit the scram button. 178 graphite-tipped control rods were lowered into the core at a sluggish 40 centimeters per second, when only 9 had been inserted previously, meaning that after the spike in energy from the graphite, it would take at least 6 seconds to cool the spiked energy under the best circumstances. The power jumped from 200 to 500 and then to 30,000, 10 times the operating capacity of the reactor, because the nuclear core was now melting down. The temperature rose to 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit, close to the surface of the sun, and the fuel rods disintegrated. The generated steam forced through the turbines roared like a car, and the walls around the men of Control Room 4 vibrated. The turbines slowed, as if the race car that was the erupting reactor had suddenly hit the brakes and skid, and then roared again. And then came the blast. The 2,000 metric ton concrete biological shield that sat above the reactor exploded through the roof of Unit 4. The entire reactor was fastened to this plate, anchoring it to the ground, but when it collapsed back in place, it was off kilter, allowing radiation to escape into the night sky. Less than a minute had passed since the turbine test began, when the mixture of hydrogen and oxygen building up in the supernova that was the reactor ignited and ripped the reactor apart with the force of 66 tons of TNT.
Holy shit.
Later, when Dyatlov was asked by superiors to explain what happened, he said,
I don't know. I don't understand any of it.
"The swiftness with which the disaster occurred left the crew members blindsided. They hadn't thought a reactor could explode. Nobody thought that this could happen. So for a moment, they believed that they were experiencing an earthquake. They could not see the graphite blocks from the moderator core of the reactor landing on top of Unit 3. Nor could they see the building illuminated with the fire of the eye of hell that they'd opened. Some off-duty workers fishing from the reactor cooling pond saw it happen and apparently did nothing. But then again, what were they going to do?
Right.
A worker in a different unit felt the blasts, and then the door of the room he was in was blown off the hinges. And he ran for cover, believing the Americans had bombed the plant.
No, the call's coming from inside the house.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And then a mushroom cloud rose up a kilometer high above the plant, filled with some of the most dangerous carcinogenic substances known to us, like radioactive iodine-131, neptunium-239, cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium-239. This mushroom cloud was swept away on the wind towards Pripyat, Moscow, and Scandinavia.
Because they didn't have the safety shield. Because fuck it.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, it was too expensive to be safe.
Yep.
Former nuclear submariner Anatoly Kyrgyz was on shift and saw the cloud of steam rolling toward him in the reactor shop. Although he was exposed first, he managed to close the pressurized shop door and save his life and those of his colleagues before he lost consciousness. The first person to die was Valery Kodemchuk, who was killed at his position near the main circulation pumps, either by being crushed from the building collapsing or he was vaporized in the second explosion. Volodymyr Sashanuk was monitoring the indicators on Unit 4 when it exploded, and the bursting hot water and steam pipes surrounding his post caused severe burns to his entire body. Although he did not die on the spot as Kodemchuk did, Sashanuk only survived a few hours in the hospital. At 1:25, the master status board of Fire Station Number 2 in Pripyat lit up with red warning lights as every room at Chernobyl indicated an emergency. Every available fire brigade in the Kyiv region was summoned to battle the blaze, and while their tanker truck showered water down into the building from outside, the crew led by Dyatlov inside worried that there was no water left in the reactor, because they still didn't think that the reactor had been completely destroyed. People groped their way through the plant, trying to get a handle on the chaos in the dark of a power outage and with the air filling with concrete dust and smoke that smelt of ozone, which quickly induced nausea because it also contained radioactive isotopes. It wasn't until 2 workers made their way into the pump room in the adjacent hall that used to connect the reactor that anyone comprehended the true nature of the disaster. Because this hall, which used to go into another room of the building, now opened up into the heart of the reactor and the dark of the night sky, illuminated by a bluish-white light that shot straight into the heavens. Beneath this electric beam, radioactive, ionized, superheated metal and rock from the destroyed unit glowed in a phosphorescent spectrum of color, and the men who witnessed it realized that they were gazing upon an unshielded nuclear reactor.
Wow.
This illumination made the reactor visible from the outside as well, and one of the firefighters on scene is quoted as saying,
Lads, it's the guts of the reactor. If we survive until morning, we'll live forever.
We're all going to be Spider-Man when we get out of here. By 2 a.m., the mayor of Pripyat, the plant's KGB mayor, the chief of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Kyiv, the USSR Atomic Energy Authorities in Moscow, and the Ukrainian Energy Ministry were informed of the situation. But all that could be done was to provide them with continuous reports, and they had no idea what the fuck to do about it. Even then, responders were either in denial of the damage or had no way to fully comprehend it, because I cannot emphasize enough that nobody thought a nuclear reactor could explode. A number of plant leaders believed that the situation could be remedied to some degree if the reactor could be cooled, either with water or by trying to manually lower the control rods from where they'd gotten stuck because of the explosion. And so, with this belief in mind, 3 men made their way to the heart of the reactor, the most dangerous spot on the planet at the moment, to move these rods. And they unknowingly stepped onto the literal edge of an exposed nuclear core as it was melting down. These 3 men were blasted with heat at the edge of the destroyed reactor, and though they were only there for about a minute before they were like, there ain't no fucking way, that was all that it took for them to be exposed to a fatal dose of radiation. So a lethal dose of radiation is 4 to 5 sieverts, and a sievert is a weighted approximation of the likelihood that an exposure will cause cancer in human tissue. But rather than simply being the dose at which, this is determined to kill 50% of an exposed population, and LD50 for a chemical, a lethal dose of radiation is more specifically the dose that kills a population within 30 days.
So it doesn't have to be immediate.
It doesn't have to be immediate, but it's also pretty small if you're looking at the worst fucking thing we've ever done on the planet. So a sievert is the biological measurement for a joule of radiation absorbed per kilogram of matter, and a joule is a watt second. So it's just the best thing that we have to determine how badly we specifically are being fucked up. It can be full body, it can be certain parts of the body, and it's weighted for different types of radiation. So 5 sieverts is approximately how much damage was done to the whole body at 1.2 meters away from the blast at Hiroshima. There were 600 workers on site at the Chernobyl power plant the night of the explosion, and 186 firefighters were called in from the surrounding area. It's estimated that 134 of these men received radiation doses between 1 to 16 sieverts. No. Although exact measurements...
3 times the lethal dose?
Yeah.
3 to 4 times?
Yeah. But it's difficult to get exact measurements because the dosimeters worn by the workers were all overexposed and just fucking blown out. So
I cannot compute too much. Yeah, we weren't meant to measure something this bad.
No. No, nobody thought that it could get this bad. Even Hiroshima, they didn't think it could get this bad. This astronomical amount of whole body exposure to gamma rays, beta particles, and neutrons, in the worst cases, resulted in acute radiation sickness that killed the most severely exposed of these men within 4 months of the accident, while others took years to recover. The reason so many workers and first responders were sickened so badly is not because they all came this close to the reactor, of course. But when the core first exploded, it sent irradiated fuel cells, graphite, and masonry flying just everywhere. And anyone who came close to these materials, especially the graphite and the uranium dioxide fuel, they became exposed with a lethal dose of radiation in as little as 4 minutes. And so if you're on the roof of Unit 3 and you're trying to get rid of the burning, because it's so hot, being near these hot rocks, figuratively and literally, is giving you a lethal dose of radiation. Being on the ground with these hot rocks. And in the sanitary zone, there were some people who saw graphite pebbles burning into the leaves of their strawberry plants.
Ugh.
So it was just
everywhere.
I want to make a distinction here that I feel like is important to point out as well, is that I said that all of these things were irradiated. And it's not like everything that gets exposed to radiation will itself become radioactive, obviously, right? Lots of things give off radiation, but for something to be considered radioactive, it has to give off ionizing radiation, which I think I described in the Manhattan Project, but I'll say it again. Ionizing radiation is the amount of radiation that is needed to ionize atoms by removing electrons from them. And so things like cell phones, pasteurization, sunburns even, those are forms of radiation that they can cause problems. Sunburns can cause sun cancer and things like that. But they're not ionizing. Pasteurizing your food is not ionizing your food.
Right.
It's just killing pathogens.
Right.
Once you hit 10 to 33 electron volts, this ionization can happen in any substance. It can happen in human DNA, and this is typically what causes cancer, and that's part of what the point of determining sievert measurements is. So 10 to 33, that's ionizing. That's where the danger starts. At energies above 600,000 electron volts, it has to be pretty intense. Neutrons or high-energy photons will bounce into other atoms and produce more neutrons and change the atoms they bounce off of into new radioactive ones. This is induced radioactivity, and it can happen in like some forms of radiotherapy, like for cancer treatment. But it is also common at the core of nuclear reactors. This is why the men of K-19, the submarine, were able to contaminate the submarine that came to save the crew, and why the graphite from the core of Unit 4 at Chernobyl was able to poison the men who worked even at a distance from the exposed reactor. It is...
That makes a lot of sense. That was really helpful, actually.
Thank you. Like, I'm not an expert in nuclear chemistry by any means, but I'm like, this seems important for me to get across.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. No, that's super helpful. Like, I didn't understand, like, what makes something radioactive. Like,
I mean, it's almost beyond comprehension that, like, a human being can end up
radioactive.
Right. But it just, like, once you have induced radioactivity, there's no surviving that. Like, anybody who they themselves becomes radioactive, that means that their cells are different now, and they're a radioactive isotope of what they used to be, and they're poisoning the healthy cells in their body. Like, there's no coming back from that. If it's radiotherapy from, like, cancer, I think that they can do things for you, but, like, when it's whole body irradiation, like, you're toast. Many of these graphite blocks, as I said, landed on top of Unit 3, which had the closest water hoses to Unit 4. Against safety recommendations, the roof of Unit 3, and probably all the units, was covered in a petroleum-based bitumen, which caught fire upon contact with the hot graphite blocks. And so they were causing more flames, and the fireworkers were just kicking them off the building, unknowingly exposing themselves and the people below them to high levels of radiation. And they knew that the situation wasn't good. These are all people of Pripyat, or mostly people of Pripyat. But even as these first responders and workers fell unconscious, vomited uncontrollably, or even became temporarily blinded by what was going on around them, they had no option but to continue. The melting bitumen burned the hoses, rendering them useless, and so tanker trucks were driven to the edge of the cooling ponds, filled with used water from the reactor. The earth between the road and the pond was littered with debris, and so a man named Peter Chavry had to clear the way. And when metal rods got stuck in the tires, he pulled them out of the tires by hand.
No.
These rods were so radioactive that they peeled the skin from his hand like a glove. What's worse is that Chavry...
Oh, good. Thank you.
It always gets worse.
It always gets worse. Thank you, Kayla. What?
He was so thirsty from battling the fire and running and his exposure to radiation that he drank from one of the hoses.
No.
Only 1 or 2 quick sips before someone stopped him because they knew the water was contaminated, but that was all that it took to severely damage his digestive tract. When they finally did get water to the burning reactor, the firefighters were met with a hydra of a problem. The more water they sprayed, the worse the fire seemed to get. And this is likely because they were pouring water onto the remaining fuel cells, still at temperatures around 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which ignited on contact with air and upon contact with water released explosive oxygen and hydrogen gases and radioactive steam. In other locations, the fires were fueled by 200 metric tons of spilled machine oil, and the water only served to spread that fuel, which threatened the integrity of all the reactors at the plant.
Okay.
Do you need a quick break from the misery, or
No, keep it coming. Keep it coming.
Down on the ground, workers were being led to ambulances as they suffered from headaches and nausea, but medical staff were not prepared to deal with the effects of acute radiation sickness. The only doctor on duty in Pripyat and the first to arrive on scene came armed with nothing more than painkillers, expecting he was summoned to treat burns.
I mean, this sounds so much like the K-19.
I know.
This sounds like he's like, I have aspirin. Like, I don't know what you want from me.
That's basically
like,
this guy.
Yeah.
And the workers were trying to tell him what was going on inside, but he didn't think a reactor could explode. He couldn't believe what they were talking about. And so he gave them diazepam and promethazine, which is an antiemetic for their headaches and nausea. And it wasn't until he started treating the firefighters that had a bit more intense symptoms that he realized he was dealing with radiation sickness, and he began administering potassium iodide, which he did have on hand.
Okay.
And potassium iodide is literally just a molecule containing one potassium and one iodine. It's administered during nuclear emergencies because when a reactor goes, it releases large amounts of radioiodine into the environment, specifically that iodine-131. There was actually some discussion about the radiochemistry of the reactor going from a xenon well to an iodine well, which, like, in a few minutes I'll get to, but I couldn't find any papers where I was like, what the fuck is an iodine reactor, where anyone broke it down. It was just papers who were like, you know what an iodine reactor is.
Right? Like, moving on.
Yeah. So, I don't know how to explain it, but there is a lot of iodine that is released when shit goes down.
Okay.
And iodine concentrates in the thyroid gland because it's essential to our natural thyroid hormones. And this is actually why we iodize salt to prevent goiters. For this reason, radioiodine is highly concentrated in the thyroid and can lead to thyroid cancer, especially in exposed children. And the younger the child, the higher the risk. Potassium iodide essentially saturates the thyroid with enough iodine that the radioiodine just isn't absorbed. It kind of just passes through the body.
Okay.
And it can be administered even 3 to 4 hours after exposure. It won't work as well, but you can still administer it like in a delayed setting.
Okay.
As of 2001, the FDA established a new guidance for when to administer potassium iodide in the U.S. For children 0 to 18 and pregnant individuals, it's recommended to administer it at no higher than 0.05 sieverts of exposure, which seems reasonable. That's, pretty low. For individuals 18 to 40, you don't want any higher than 0.1 sieverts before you administer. But for some reason, when you're 40 and over, it's just fine to not receive it until you get that 5 sieverts. Oh. And maybe that's because you're already so old that they think it's unlikely for you to develop cancer specifically from this exposure. I don't know. It just seemed very odd to me. I was
that seems odd. That's an odd threshold. Like when you're 40, you're good to go. You're good. Any cancers you get, not from this. Not from this.
This seems like age discrimination.
Yeah, a little bit. A little bit.
Plant workers who are responsible for radiation safety urged the need to report the crisis to authorities as they collected energy readings that were simply off the charts. And we've already talked about how, like, quite a few authorities knew, but, like, not everyone did, not, like, the high-ups in Moscow did, and there's still, like, not a whole lot is being done to help other than this, like, local first response. When authorities did arrive around 3 a.m., they announced that the readings were thousands of times lower than the safety experts said they were, and declared that, quote, some people here understand nothing and are stoking panic. Yeah, fuck you, guy. Like,
yeah, I'm not gonna give it an sure. That's an fuck you.
Right. And I don't fucking get it because it's like you're breathing the same air as us here,
right?
Dude.
Like I mean, they have to know that. Like they have to say that with the breath of like, we're fucked. Like I'm fucked.
I don't see how you can't.
Yeah,
it's baffling.
Yeah.
So they hear this. The safety experts hear this, and they're like, that's some fucking bullshit. And so attempts were made to call out higher up in the chain of command. But when calls were eventually received, and like calls are kind of being shut off. Like they are cutting off communication from Chernobyl to shut down this panic monitoring and whatever. But when calls were finally received, they weren't believed because there's no way that this happened. Like this is some sort of joke. This is a prank. This did not happen.
Bruh, it's a prank. It's a prank, bro. Like,
Right.
It's a prank. Like, oh my God.
Like, who would call a prank and be like, Chernobyl exploded? Like,
Yeah, like,
what? But even workers at the plant who were not in control room 4 thought the explosion had to have been started by some sort of external force, like a faulty generator. Because, again, no one who didn't see the destruction happen themselves could believe it. It was just beyond belief.
Right.
Down in the coolant pipeline, 2 men worked to open the valves to release supply water to the reactor, which was no easy task. The 2 were Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptanov, and since the power to the wheel that controlled the valves had been lost, it's this giant wheel that you have to turn in order to open the valve, and like it was basically like when you lose power steering to your steering wheel, right? And you just have to crank it.
Really crank it, yeah.
Manually. They were only able to turn this giant wheel a centimeter at a time.
Oh my God.
And they're ankle deep in radioactive water that's pouring in from the ceiling above them. After working for 6 hours in gamma radiation that contaminated their clothes and increased their exposure, besides the fucking water, they were finally joined by colleagues who found them and helped them to get the valves open at 7:30 a.m. By that point, they were suffering from intense acute radiation sickness that sapped their strength and caused them to vomit constantly in their attempts to get this open. For their efforts to save the plant, their colleagues, and perhaps even their city and their country, Akimov died on May 11th, and Toptanov died 3 days later. Unfortunately, they did not know that the fire had been brought under control 30 minutes beforehand. And once the supply water was released, it couldn't go to Unit 4 because all of the pipes were destroyed. So instead, it ran through the corridors and stairwells of the demolished building. And it emptied the supply water for cooling Unit 3. Luckily.
Okay.
Luckily.
Luckily. We get a luckily in this episode? I didn't think we'd get a luckily in this one. Okay, I'm sitting up.
Between an unfortunately and unsurprisingly. But yes, we get a luckily. Luckily, further destruction was avoided because the fires on roof 3 refused to be tamed, and so that reactor was shut down. Yay! Unit 3 won't explode.
I mean, because that would have, like,
can you even fucking imagine?
Yeah, like, so this is a big luckily. This is a big luckily.
Unsurprisingly, the veil of secrecy fell over the plant. As I said, they were cutting off communication, but the deputy head of the party for Kyiv had taken over at the plant, and the Interior Ministry troops were now in chemical warfare suits and respirators and were blocking access to the plant. And although 132 people were admitted to the Pripyat hospital on the morning of the 26th, and a cloud of smoke hovered over the plant, the workers who were sent home at the end of their shifts were told to say nothing. And obviously the people in Pripyat know something's going on. It's only 2.5 miles away. Like,
yeah, like they know, like something is not right. Like,
right.
Well, and especially when their loved ones are coming home, because that's quite a few people. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, well,
they're gonna be like, "Oh, honey, how was work?"
Yeah.
It
was fine.
I'm radioactive now.
Yeah, right.
But they probably didn't even realize that.
No. I mean, the ones who were themselves radioactive, they're probably at the hospital. But the people who are coming home with radioactive clothes, like if nobody was taking care to decontaminate them before they went home, like, yeah, it's not looking good in Pripyat.
No.
But they don't have any choice other than just to carry on with life, like everything was normal. There were actually 7 weddings scheduled for that day, and none of them were canceled. Just gotta carry on. Despite the fact that the area within 3 kilometers of the reactor has 10 sieverts being delivered to the thyroid specifically. Good stuff. And Pripyat had readings of 1 sievert, just like ambient.
Throughout the city. Yeah.
Yes. The citizens and children of the city were being exposed to 3 times the dose of radiation that was considered unsafe but acceptable for workers in nuclear plants in emergency situations. And, like, that's a kind of a measurement that we use a lot. Is like, okay, if you're around this a lot, like, your exposure is going to be a little bit higher. And, like,
Right.
we do want to look out for you, but, like, we have this exposure. These are children that were
Right.
like, you know, you live in Pripyat, and you
What
were
did you
born
expect?
here. Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
Around 4 p.m., the Atomic Energy Response's medical team began to triage patients at the Pripyat hospital. Many were in serious condition, suffering from thermal burns and vomiting, and the deputy mayor of Pripyat told the Moscow Institute of Biophysics that at least 25 of these patients desperately needed to be evacuated to Moscow. He actually received permission for this, but more patients were coming in all the time from the plant, and the people of the city were endangered. The hospital director decided that everyone in Pripyat should receive prophylactic iodine to protect their thyroids from iodine-131. Unfortunately, there weren't enough iodine pills in the city for all the citizens, and the accident still had to remain a secret, so you can't, like, put out, right, a loud announcement.
right. Like, take this.
Right.
Some of you take this. Some of you take this. What we have
Right.
enough for. Why? That's none of your business.
Right. Well, they can't really say anything out loud to the people they're asking, so they ask these neighboring districts. They're just like, we need your iodine for reasons. And
Right.
they were sent the potassium iodine, so, like, at least there's another, luckily. Like, they get the prophylactic iodine. But at the same time, a new threat was being discovered back at the plant. With some nuclear fuel still remaining in the reactor that was now exposed to air, it was possible that a chain reaction could be initiated that they had no way of controlling. And so this is what I was talking about. It was in some sort of iodine well, and now it's coming out of the well, and they're getting these readings that it's coming out of the well, it's waking up. Already efforts were initiated to quench the nuclear fuel by pouring boric acid into the water tanks of the cooling system because boron absorbs neutrons.
Okay.
But like all of the water that was meant to cool the reactor, this slurry of boron and water just spilled out into the demolished remains of the building. It didn't go where it was supposed to. So the steam continued to billow out from the unit, suggesting that a fire was not deadened, as they had declared earlier in the morning, and that there was something going on that was still superheating these materials and causing steam, but it had to have been buried deep in the unit, and so it couldn't be accessed safely with firefighting foam or, like, anything to smother it. Physicists at the plant estimated that they only had about 3 hours, maybe 5, before this criticality began, renewing fires and explosions and the release of gamma rays and neutron radiation. Given this new information and the imminent danger presented not only to Chernobyl but nearby Pripyat as well, experts urged the authorities to evacuate the city. But those authorities dismissed the warnings as alarmist and said the evacuation would cause a panic that would be worse than the radiation. In reality, they were worried about word spreading, and the incident at Chernobyl would be a global humiliation for the Soviet Union, that they were really trying to not let that information get out.
I think somebody's gonna find out.
Yeah. Maybe. It's only the world's largest nuclear disaster. You can't keep it under wraps.
No.
As 7 p.m. approached and the sun went down over the region, a red-crimson light glowed over the power plant, igniting the horizon. Plans for evacuation by city officials began at 8 p.m., including assembling buses and trains in the Chernobyl district. But permission had to be granted first. And so the physicists held their breath. They were in the danger zone now, and the reactor could awaken at any moment. Just after 9 p.m., 3 more explosions sent red-hot fuel rods and graphite into the night sky above Unit 4. Then, as if on cue to fuel the devastation, the wind suddenly picked up, shepherding the newly released radiation toward Pripyat. The deputy at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy pleaded with the government commission, saying,
I am pleading with you to evacuate the people because I don't know what will happen to the reactor tomorrow. It is ungovernable. We are pouring water, but we don't know where it's going. We are doing something that has never been done before. And as a scientist, I can't foretell today what the consequences may be.
Still, the government representatives pushed back. Regulations...
Okay, like, let it go.
Right.
Gotta go.
Yeah.
Like, it's time.
Well,
It's time.
they had reasons. They were bad reasons, but they had reasons.
Okay.
Regulations established in 1963 stated that civil populations did not need to be evacuated until the radiation reached 0.25 sieverts. And it had, right? So it has in Pripyat. But officials were either lying or they were just very, very confused about the reports of radiation, because typically they were given reports in milliröntgens, which I've been avoiding talking about because it's just easier to give everybody one unit. But
yeah. Okay. I liked that.
Thank you. But so typically they're getting these milliröntgen readings, but lately with the reaction they've been getting röntgens, which are 1,000 times higher, and they're like, that number cannot be right. You are confusing the number. It can't be right. And they're like, no, I'm confusing you because it's super fucking astronomically high and we need to get the fuck out of here.
Right. Like, instead of talking about it, we gotta go. Like, yeah. It's time to leave. It's time to leave.
So officials finally gave in around 1 a.m. on April 27th, giving city officials a mere 2 hours to prepare a list of citizens for evacuations, which were to begin in the morning, later on in the morning. Instead, it officially began at 2 p.m., nearly 36 hours after the first explosion. Still, the citizens were not fully informed of the situation and were told to only pack enough clothing and food for 2 or 3 days. By 5 p.m., all 49,000 residents of the city had been evacuated to cities across Ukraine, never to return to their abandoned homes in Pripyat. But that is a story for another time. So that is the end of Chernobyl Part 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sure is.
Yeah, this has been a harder one to research, and I kept telling Venus, I was like, I don't want to turn it into another Jonestown episode, but I also want it to be one episode. And
I knew this was not one episode. I knew that you were you don't miss the mark. You don't miss the mark. But I that one I was like, there's no way. There's no way. I was talking about it with my partner. I was like, unless it's a 2 to 3 hour one-parter. Like,
which is what I mean. I don't want to do another 2 to 3 hour. Like, people seem to really enjoy it. You all really like the Jonestown episode, and I'm glad you do, but that was a lot.
That was a lot. That one was like, there were breaks. There were, like, that one was a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're splitting up
how
misery.
Traumatic to, like, never go back to your home, though.
I know.
You know, like,
yeah.
Thinking you're just going on a little staycation.
Yeah. It's only going to be a few days, and then we'll get this under control. Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. So.
Well, until next time, I suppose.
Until next time.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus Stay safe, and remember,
the dose makes the poison.